promotional materials. I've done it for a decade, and I haven't seen ever a collection as thorough and diverse as this one. So thank you. Thank you also to Joseph and the Kadist for hosting us, and to Ian for writing Resisting the Virtual Life, which was a book that when I hit grad school showed me that there was someone other than John Perry Barlow writing about the internet, and it was enormously helpful to me. It sort of showed me how to be critical. So my essay in the book, and I guess we're going to start talking about that a little bit, is an essay that begins with the word bohemian technocracy. And, you know, I want to go back to Jeff's talk from a moment ago, say a few words about where the bohemian technocrats fit in that group, and then I think Ian and I will open it up to discussion. Jeff's book includes representatives of a wide variety of different kinds of social protests. The group that I'm most interested in, I would call technocrats, and they are the Stewart Brand folks who brought us the Whole Earth catalog. And I'm going to pass it around here because this is my pass-around copy. Don't worry if it tears, the paper is old. There are a million others out there. For that crowd, technocracy and mainstream America was both something to be loathed and something to be imitated. And it's this paradox that I think haunts a lot of our time today. You know, for Brand, you know, in his oh God, how much history to tell? Okay, in the article I talk about two groups. I talk about Brand and the Whole Earth crew and the Radical Software crew, and I'll do a very, very brief history of each. Brand and his wife Lois, starting in 1968, head out to a whole series of new communes that are being built. As you may know, 1966 to 1972 is the period of the greatest rise of communes in all of American history, a country founded with the communal impulse. As many as 750,000 Americans, by reliable estimates, were living either back on the land or in apartments, in communal apartments in the cities. That communalist movement was political in a way that was very different than the SDS, lefty, new left politics were. For the new left, you wanted to do politics to change politics. For the new communalists, you want to turn away from that and to build a different life. And they turned away from it toward design, toward consumption, and toward information and information systems in particular as a basis of a new kind of community. The Whole Earth catalog, I would argue, is the paradigmatic example of that. It's a fascinating document if you haven't seen it before. How many of you had one in the house growing up? Just checking? Excellent, I'm among friends. Thank you. Yeah, it's helpful, thanks. So, the Whole Earth catalog is a fascinating catalog because you can't buy anything with it. It's partly modeled on the Sears catalog, but instead of buying things, what you can do is find out where to get things. It's an access device, it's an information system. But it's not all put together by Stewart Brand and his wife Lois. Rather, it's put together by readers who mail in recommendations for things you ought to be looking at, knowing about, and so forth. Now, this should be very familiar to us in our social media era. In its own time, it was quite new, and it had a secondary effect that's very powerful. It turned the Whole Earth catalog into a map of the communes that were springing up around the country, because their representatives would write in. The Whole Earth catalog is a prototype of a different kind of society, bound into a book and offered up to readers as something they could have in the house as a sort of key to possibilities. Now, it's also, I think, it also has a very pernicious legacy, and I want to hit this fairly hard. As I was going through Jeff's book before coming here today, I was seeing how diverse and how outraged the points of view were, and how much faith people had that if they spoke the truths that they saw around them, if draft resistors resisted and spoke out, the world would actually change. And I'm struck today, for all of the discourse available on the web, by the silence that surrounds us. And I want to argue that, to my intense frustration, some of that silence is the product of the work of the bohemian technocrats who I've written about. The New Left did politics to change politics. The new communalists behind the Whole Earth catalog and then later Radical Software, I can talk about them in more length, were folks who trusted in communication, in media technology, in patterns of consumption, in wearing the right clothes, in getting the fringe on the jacket just right, as a way to make a new world. Now, I think that strategy is one that we see around us in this neighborhood. I would argue it's in fact a quintessentially Bay Arean strategy. But it's one that's had a whole slew of pernicious effects. As those of you who were perhaps involved in communes would know, many of them were not intentionally, but in fact racially segregated, extraordinarily heteronormative, and actually radically conservative despite the clothing. If you doubt me, go back and pull out your old Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young albums, and you'll see on the cover that the men are dressed like cowboys and the women are wearing long, flowing dresses. Your Allman Brothers albums will have the same effect. I think what I want to say is that the turn toward design and communication as modes for making an alternative society also represents both a turn away from the effort to do politics as politics, and a turn toward precisely the forces that make it so necessary to do politics as politics. A turn toward consumption, a turn toward the self as the site of politics, and a turn toward expression as what I would think of as the illusion of political action. I think we labor under the illusion that expressing ourselves and forming ourselves up as politically alert subjects is sufficient to change the world. And I think that's an illusion. Over to you.
Yeah, greetings everyone. Thank you, Joseph, for making this happen. This is great. And and to Jeff and Pam for putting this book together. Very, very helpful. As we some of the retort gang got together to work on what became West of Eden, what we call the Communes Project in about 2003. We were struck how little ethnography and serious research was done on this extraordinary moment in history. And I'll come in a minute to challenge Fred's, well, he'd probably be able to rebut this, but the new communalists that he's concentrating on were an important part, a subset of what happened. But I think the enduring question for me, and for those of us who worked on the West of Eden, is in a way, there's still the mystery of what happened in those years, 64 to 74. Why this explosion of commenting. And there's another book fairly recently, I have copies here somewhere, A History of the Underground Press. On the Ground, does that ring a bell? It's in I'll pull it out from behind in a minute. But it's essentially an oral history of people who were working in the world of the underground, so-called underground press. It's described by some of them as kind of like a field of mushrooms. You know, thousands of these, hundreds, thousands of these publications sprang up. Now, of course, the whole Earth catalogue is a very important thing to discuss, and I thank Fred as well for his great book, for the work done on excavating that history from counterculture to cyberculture. As I said in a review of the book, it seemed to me that the question was brilliant. How was it that the computer, at the moment when students at Berkeley had round their necks, right, the punch cards, which emblematized all that was dehumanizing, alienating. It was a kind of synecdoche for omnicide and soul murder. How come that within one generation this machine had been transvalued into the nimble techniques of freedom, the liberation machine? That's a really productive question, right? It was terrific for Fred to ask that question. Now, the answer, I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with anything that I've read or that we did in trying to understand, as I say, this efflorescence of communalism and commoning that happened at the moment of, I suppose it was the longest boom in capitalist history, but why it was that literally tens of thousands of people went to live in community. Thousands of young teenagers got on Greyhound buses and headed west, in exile from the Valium-soaked suburbs of Connecticut and elsewhere. And some of them, within weeks, found themselves outside the law, not having any strong politics. Teenage girls who started to work, for example, in the intensive work we did on the string of communes on Albion Ridge. Those of you who know Mendocino, there was a number of communes. We did a kind of a close study of a group of communes up on Albion Ridge. And in a barn we found, just one day they put down, and they never did another, they did no more printing, but there was the hand press that produced Country Women, which advocated natural childbirth in a state where midwifery is criminalized. It's a very interesting history that goes, I think, quite well beyond if we confine ourselves to the fascinating question of Silicon Valley and the counterculture. But and I just, maybe some of that might come up in conversation. I suppose I want to say right now that this is a very good week to be discussing Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks, the biohackers and the DIY gene splicers, about to send out packages of seed for glow-in-the-dark Arabidopsis, thanks to Kickstarter. This is kind of an interesting set of questions raised by the history that produced this social movement, which I think is tackled powerfully, with the aid of work that Fred's done, by Lee Warden in his chapter on West of Eden. I think I'll just say something by way of, again, another puzzle, before we open it up.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Which has to do with the particular, in general, about techniques and particular ensemble of human prosthetics and machinery. Because remember that what's called the Industrial Revolution, I think it's a misnomer, which is really what we're really talking about is the great enclosure, the concentration of production in what became factories. That world historical event actually depended on water power, on machinery that was available and used by the Romans. So I don't buy any version of technological determinism. But I will say this, I certainly don't agree with liberals or Marxists who take technologies to be neutral. In the case of liberals, it's kind of like there are good uses and there are bad uses. For the Marxist, of course, it's just that it's either free or fettered. It's in the wrong hands. They thrill to the sound of large tractors, Stalinists have done, because they are the means of production that allow us to imagine an ample world to get us from prehistory, from a world of constraint to a world of freedom, of abundance. That was the idea. That is not satisfactory in my view. So if techniques are not neutral, but nor are they determining, because they always outrun the imagination of the inventor, then what are they? They're some other thing. And the way I've theorized it is to, and I began this work in Resisting Virtual Life, but I think it needs further developing at this moment historically, because we're again at ground zero, as they say, of a new burst of enclosures and evictions and accumulation. I think the question then is, how do we assess particular ensemble of technologies? I mean, given that these extraordinary productions that mushroomed from the mid-60s for a decade were using, Victorian technology. It's not that there was anything new there, no. The main point was self-exploitation, what today would be called internships, right? It was people giving their own free labor out of, it was a kind of an eros effect, to use George Kaplan's term. No, it's not that there was anything desperately new about the particular ensemble of techniques. But I think it's possible to say this, that what we need to do is to ask ourselves of any particular technical innovation, what forms of life does it conduce, and what forms of life, as it were, have to be worked against or uphill for a more ample world and life in common. So, for example, I was involved in the resistance, open and clandestine, to the genetically, to the transgenes that were released first in the East Bay, anywhere, that had been developed on the roof of the bookbindery down on San Pablo, and Advanced Genetic Sciences planted out strawberries with the flounder gene in, so that they could produce these things a little further north to get a competitive advantage. Again, it had nothing to do with taste, but this is all to do with, the political economy of agriculture. So I think we need to ask ourselves, and it's a very hard question, what is our attitude to a particular set of technical novelties? Well, we're not going to, it's not easy to say what that is. And it's not easy to be provisional about it either, because the two technologies that I'm passionate about, which I mentioned to Fred and Jeff when we went to get some coffee, I found years later, after thinking about it, namely the bicycle and the radio, they were, for me, technologies of liberation. When I was a boy, the radio, I built a little crystal set, and I was sent away to one of these carceral institutions at the age of 6 to be trained up to run an empire they didn't tell me didn't exist anymore. In a kind of Foucauldian total institution. And the radio brought the outside world in. And the bicycle allowed me to go out into the world. But you see, wait a minute. The nimble technology of freedom that is our own personal computer, it depends entirely on the social relations that the user is in. I mean, tell that to the data entry neo-slaves, in the third world. Or tell the Bihari down from the hills who's working in the joggies of Delhi on a tricycle. These heroic improvisations that make the cities of the South work, right? So, in a way, it completely depends, but again, not completely. So, I'm fascinated to ask the question about the threshold we're on now in relation to the new round of accumulation in Silicon Valley. What lessons we can get from looking at design history, from the use of the printing press, and whether it's possible even to imagine doing what, at least for the first time in history, happened a few years ago, where the resistance to a new technique, namely the gene splicing, forced the nation states for the first time ever to stage a public debates. This was in Britain, before the technology had arrived. This is unusual. And I think actually, one of the things we have to do, and I'll finish with this thought, that we have to do, and I think we can become agents in this room because we've got people here who are involved in this machinery. I was very alarmed when I had an exchange with Julian Assange in London when he was still, before he'd gone into full hiding, in which it became clear that he presumed that there was a techno fix, that by the use of a firewall, that he was going to be able to construct a technological means to guarantee, democratic transparency. And he blamed Bradley Manning, essentially, for being naive. Well, what kind of social movement can we really expect to build in order to construct a more ample world of life in common? If it depends on technical means like that, I don't think it's possible. I think it's a mistake.
I think what we want to open it up and talk with you. We know that there are a lot of folks in the audience who've been in conversation with us in different ways, and so I do want to open it up. I want to add only one thing, which is just the word institutions. My great concern with the technological fix that Ian described is that it takes us away from thinking about the kinds of institutions that we need to build and the ways that we need to reach out across lines to folks who are very different than ourselves. I'm struck as I look out in the audience, I think we're 97% white. The age range is 25 to 60. Where I'm going is that this looks a lot like the counterculture look, the technocratic counterculture. And I remain concerned that we haven't begun to build the kinds of institutions that reach out to folks who don't look like us, who are very different than us. And I think our hopes for technological fixes make that particularly difficult and are themselves a legacy of the counterculture. So I'd like to just stop there and open it up. Does that make sense? Yeah, great.
Let's go.
Well, you mentioned something about you didn't think that the technology of the web at the time was any different than I think you just said something like the Victorian era. But the availability of cheap paper and electric typewriters made a dramatic difference, right? I mean, even the article that Jeff talks about, it's about a person using an electric typewriter to make an article, and you wouldn't have been able to do that if you didn't have a typewriter, especially electric typewriter, or even cheap paper.
Which of us? I think it was Ian you were talking to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, so you don't think that those technological advances really made a difference? That it really was? Those didn't really make a difference in the ability to do this?
So this electric typewriter
And cheap paper
was necessary for the counterculture, for the cheap paper.
Was it necessary to do this printing? To be able to do this kind of media communication?
Offset, cheap offset.
Cheap
printing,
offset.
Getting out of union, expensive union
Could be.
printers, actually.
Could be. Because I'm hesitating just because there's a kind of social history of reading that would have to be fed into this. There was an explosion of pamphleteering in the after the collapse of censorship in Britain, 1642. All the language that we think of as, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, is pretty much already there. And it comes out of a frenzy of pamphleteering in the 1640s. Now, the paper was not as cheap, but on the other hand, each copy was read by many more. And so, again, we'd need a kind of history of reading, I think, to compare I mean, I take the point, and of course every new development will change probably the conditions of circulation and reading, but I'm not convinced that the electric typewriter was the thing that triggered it.
I want to help with this a little bit, and the cheap offset printing I think is especially important. I asked Stuart Brand sort of where the catalog came from, and he said that actually the one technology that helped, I'm going to get the name of the technology wrong, but it was precisely the ability to take photographs and then lay them out the way that the catalog is laid out really cheaply and easily that made the catalog possible in that sense.
Yeah. Photochemistry, like mimeograph, chemistry.
Exactly, the Mimeo is really important. The first whole catalog was actually a Mimeo that he took up to the communes. So I think that's totally important. I don't want to neglect that, but I think Ian's earlier point about how emerging technological possibilities get attached to social movements and integrated into them is really important. Of all the things you could have done, I mean, he could have been an advertising circular, he could have pursued wealth in a lot of ways. Of all the things you could have done, why the Whole Earth catalog at that particular moment? Why the kinds of publications that we see here? So I'm particularly interested in how those kinds of machines get attached to social movements in the time that they come. And my sense is that particularly in Silicon Valley, where I live, the first thing that we look at is the machine. And in fact, we need to just practice turning that around and see what are the social movements and into which the machine is being fit.
So yeah, could you relate that comment to something else which was brought up, which was the sort of Arab Spring, like
Yeah. So I've got,
yeah, it's kind of that's been brought up so many times.
I've got one word for it. One word. I'm on the edge of a rant. I'm going to try to hold it back.
Good. Let it out.
You know, I have an intense frustration. When I think of the Arab Spring, I think of one word: failure. I think the Arab Spring was an enormous failure, and as I think was, and this is going to be more painful perhaps, Occupy. And I think that they suffer from the same delusion. The delusion is that when we gather and express ourselves, things will change. There's a missing intermediary, and it's an intermediary that folks who protested the Vietnam War know very well. My first book was about Vietnam. You know, I think there's a huge difference between the Pentagon Papers and other forms of vocalization in that period. If you're gonna change a highly organized, bureaucratized corporate state, you need to invade and work to break apart and fix the institutions that are there. Heading out into the street is a great start, but it's like trying to take down a forest with an axe, you know? It's not enough. Expression is not enough. And I think that in our moment in particular, we labor under the illusion that self-formation and making ourselves a different kind of person together is sufficient for making the world a different kind of place. That's a liberal illusion that comes to us actually from the immediate post-war era. Coming to a book near you, that was my only plug today. but that's a liberal illusion from another time. And it's one that's attached to devices in which journals in particular promulgate in association with those devices. You know, the Arab Spring opened the door for interreligious conflict, for all kinds of problems in Egypt, for the oppression of the secular state, the oppression of minorities. I mean,
Syria.
Syria. Yeah, I should have said, instead of failure, I should have said Syria. You know, so I think that's a challenge for us. Yeah, but I'd like to hear you on that.
Just, yeah. Well, can I just follow up on that 1 second then? About the Arab Spring, because it relates to the green machine and my work on the streets and transportation. It's interesting to note, apart from the social media in, say, Cairo, that a necessary condition for what happened in Tahrir Square was the stopping of traffic. I mean, those of you who've been to Cairo know that it's a nightmare crossing that place. And the stopping of traffic was the condition of democratic deliberation. That was at least as key, which tells me that the struggle for the squares and for the spaces of deliberation, we're very grateful for Joseph to make this available to us, is tremendously important. And some days later, I was told by a friend, a Cairene friend, that the sound of the engines of the flatbed trucks with the goons coming back into the square was a counter-revolutionary sound. So I'm not saying that we should stop all traffic in San Francisco, but in other words, these technical instrumentalities, you know, interending. Yeah, sorry, I think.
Well, I'm just going to go back to this idea of failure. And so the implication is that failure is a bad thing.
No, okay, no.
Well, let me just finish.
Yes, thanks.
So it seems to me that one of the things that happens with these events, these kind of recurring events, is that a kind of language becomes available to us, a way of conceptualizing the possibility of change. And whether that is, you know, evolving out of personal, you know, quests or however it frames itself, it seems to me that, I mean, it's naive of us to propose that, you know, the Arab Spring is going to suddenly spring, you know, freedom and whatever that might even amount to into the world. And of course it can't do that. It can only begin incrementally to evolve us in a kind of imagining of some sort of, I mean, it's almost like some sort of utopian, you know, resolution.
So I have a very
That's
mixed
a question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm very, very mixed, right? I wrote a book about spirit brand in the whole earth world because I was very drawn to it, and I wanted to find an alternative language to the world that I lived in. I've written about Burning Man a lot. I have very ambivalent feelings about Burning Man. People out there, part of me loves it. It's like finally something that looks a little like my world, but is so much more flexible and playful. And then also, wow, the politics in there are. I always leave the fly with more business cards than I came with. But I want to get to this point of language. I applaud the pursuit of new language and new frames for understanding how we live together. I think frames that are centered in personal, individualistic, even gathered together expression are the wrong frames. You know, I think that they in fact turn us back precisely as many of the things that Jeff showed us here did. Away from social movements and the building of the kinds of institutions that we need to make change, and back toward the establishment of coalitions of folks who can agree for temporary places and in temporary squares. It's a flag without a country. I want the country. And to get the country, I think what we need to be thinking about is not how to build networks and coalitions in temporary spaces, temporary autonomous spaces, but rather how to take the networks that we build and the vision that we build in those networks and link them to or build them into institutions and make them permanent. I think that's where I'd like to see us go. You know, I look at something like Political online. It's an online, you know, group of journalists who gather together and are very aggressive in critiquing power. But they manage to institutionalize, and by institutionalizing, gain all the power that comes from having a legal standing, from having money, from having lawyers. I want to see us have that power too. And so.
Yeah, well, look, we can talk all night about the various, about the price of paper and things. Actually, the cost of these instruments is trivial compared with the free labor that went into it. The labor power was everything to do with what we saw. Everything. I mean, everything else is trivial. How was it that so many people could do that? Well, of course, we had the imposition of the wage form. The police force was invented to impose the wage form, drove a wedge between waged and unwaged labour for another world historic defeat of women, basically, who do the work of social reproduction. So that's something we should probably talk about. And of course, then you ask the question, well, how did people get by in 1970, right? I mean, of course, there was a lot of squatting. But a lot of people had to pay, if they had to get money together, it was perhaps, they had to work, let's say, 5 days a month for shelter. Nowadays it costs about, in San Francisco, between $40 and $50 a night for shelter, whether mortgage or rent. And people are working 17, 18, 20 days out of 30 just to get shelter. What time is that to work on? I don't care. I don't think the Selectric is going to give you that value added in order to do the work. But I take your point. I mean, all these are factor in to trying to understand this extraordinarily interesting explosion in, you know, graphic design and its relationship to the counterculture.
I would only note that in the counterculture there's, I think, a tremendous faith in communication as the mechanism of social change, but that faith actually comes directly out of military research in the 40s. Norbert Wiener, founder of cybernetics, argues that the way to make a new world is to construct proper feedback systems in that world, to build systems of communication. When Jimi Hendrix takes his guitar and walks up to his amp and makes it do feedback, he's doing something that is a cultural echo, a kind of on-the-ground performance of Norbert Wiener's liberal computer-based politics. And those kinds of resonances are echoing down through our experience and through our faith in communication technologies, whether paper-based, countercultural, and colorful, or pocket-based, not countercultural, but colorful.
Lee Warden in West of Eden echoes what you've been saying over and over again today, that, in the whole Earth culture emphasizes individual freedom instead of social justice, or that emphasizes personal expression instead of common good.
Yep.
Can you help me make a direct connection between the whole Earth legacy and the emphasis on individual expression and personal freedom?
Sure, it's a hard, I'll try to do it succinctly. It took me 400 pages in a book, but I'll try to do it succinctly. So I would argue that the whole Earth crowd represents a large chunk, but by no means all, of the youthful counterculture of the 1960s. And that that movement, let me tell a story. So 1966, Ken Kesey goes to the Oakland Army Induction Center as part, he's about to enter into a march, and it's the moment when the New Left and the New Communalists come together, they gather, they're going to march on the Induction Center in Oakland. Kesey gets up in front of the march, says, "Don't march. That's what they do. You want a different world, go home and make one." And then he plays Home on the Range and leaves the stage. Okay. That's a moment where he's saying, politics, that's what they do. The turn away from politics is a turn toward this kind of personal expression in a privatized space. The trouble with that, at that moment, is that it becomes, it lets go of all the apparatuses that we've created for negotiating the distribution of resources. So when you go out on communes, many communes, not all, suddenly you find that cool rules. There are no rules, so it's like, it's just not cool for you to be asking for my hamburger. It's not cool. Okay, that pattern, those people are out on the communes for a couple of years, but only a couple of years. By 73, most communes are dissolved. Where do they go? Who do they become? Well, one becomes Steve Jobs. He was a communalist for a year. Stuart Brand founds the Global Business Network, arguably one of the most influential corporate consulting firms out there. Works with partners in Shell Oil. The Brand Group in particular sets the linguistic frames by which we understand the network computer for its first 15 years. They coin or define the terms personal computer, electronic frontier, virtual community. I would argue that the habit of mind associated with that portion of the counterculture remains available to us as a set of styles. It's one of the reasons we're fascinated with the counterculture. The notion that style, consumption, the performance of the right kind of alternative self is a way of actually changing the world is something that we see from that time, inherit from that time, and have marketed to us from that time, particularly by Apple, and by folks at the Global Business Network or the Long Now Foundation. And so it's just come straight down to us through there. Does that answer your question? I'm trying to do it succinctly.
So Ken Kesey says, go home and create the revolution on your own closet or whatever.
Yep.
And then they try to articulate that, but through coolness or some sort of individual one-upmanship.
So they build communes that don't have laws. They do exactly what Ian was pointing to. They step outside the law. Now there are different communes and different communes work differently. But the communes that I'm thinking of, mostly in the American Southwest, get established without explicit rules. And in lieu of rules, we have anarchy in that sense. Pardon? They're anti-rule, right. But what happens when, what surprised me when I went to actually look at the literature, the primary sources on communes, was that there was often, in lieu of rules, norms. The same social norms that are kind of bubbling under our daily lives came back in force to provide the organization on communes. So Lois Brand said to me, she said, yeah, we used to go to communes, and Stuart would be like, Stuart would go to the big room and they would make important decisions with the men. And the women would all go out and put bleach in the water to make sure nobody got sick. The most pernicious kind of social norms from suburban valiant-taking America migrated directly onto the communes. And I think they infused the whole Earth catalog.
In terms of the whiteness question, it's important to remember that the state came after most heavily the commoning that began in Oakland and spread all over the country. The Black Panthers, again, ideologically, we've been presented with the militancy. But in West of Eden, Robin Spencer has done a tremendous job excavating the very large number of communal operations that the Panthers were involved in. And that was, brutally repressed. I mean, the same with the Red Commune on Alcatraz. And remember that for 19 months, the Indians of all tribes set up a commune on Alcatraz, which was an inspiration for liberation movements in the Fourth World, and people came from all over. Nixon was only just persuaded not to send in fixed-wing aircraft, as he did later on September the 11th on Allende's Palace. So we have to remember that, and of course that intersects with an interesting history among the rusticating communards, who in their own way of honouring the red man, invented new rituals in the countryside, often with very ambiguous, or with very dubious slogans, free love, free land. Well, for the remnants of the Miwok, when you hear free land, how does that sound? The grandchildren of those who were cut down by the 82nd Cavalry. So, I mean, it's a very fraught history, and one that there are certainly lessons for us.
And I want to say that I agree with Ian very much on the Black Panthers and on politically based communes. I think they're tremendously important, and that's a solution to the problem I'm describing in the technocratic communes. I think it's a really important one.
Rick, oh, sorry, here and then Rick, maybe?
I just wanted to say that I've seen the same rigid gender stuff on communes lately, in the last couple of years. It's not like a 60s relic, it really is pretty disgusting.
And if I could please add to that, within this current moment of Silicon Valley tech boom, the same. It's very women are not involved as much, and there's kind of this antiquated feeling, misogyny, really. Look at Reddit and stuff like that, and I'm just curious, why in these moments we kind of revert back to this,
This is the paradox of kind of collaborative peer-based action. I really like Ian's phrase commoning, and I'm maybe trying to as we talk, kind of separate it out from commons-based peer production, which is something I see a lot of. In that space, what I see happening is when rules melt away. So you're talking to a guy who wrote an article in defense of bureaucracy, okay? Something's got to do. But I'm serious, right? Like, rules allow for you to make claims for rights. You're not treating me fairly. The rule says we have to all be treated the same. I'm under the rule, I should be treated the same. Whereas, if the rule goes away and we govern by social norms, then it's like, you get the baby minute, right? And suddenly, all those norms, all those prejudices are available as the basis of action. And that's a real problem. There's a second feature in regard to info technology worlds, which is, I think, the faith that communication is somehow a disembodied activity. And that the 60s, the technocratic communes, what you want to do is govern by shared consciousness. We'll all just get our heads together, as the phrase went at the time, and we'll connect, as the phrase goes now. And connecting is a weirdly disembodied thing that, by virtue of being disembodied, takes away the language that you might otherwise have for negotiating difference in rights. And difference becomes very, very difficult to talk about. Gender is a big one. The other one that hits me over the head constantly is race and class. These things are very hard to talk about at the moment.
Just before we jump into Rick, these things actually are pretty subtle.
It's a disturbing image.
Pretty subtle. My friend Dick Sklow was fascinated by a case in Spain where an international corporation went to a community and said, if you give us a big chunk of land on the edge of town that has access down to the beach and so on, we will pay you some large amount of money and we will put a watering system into all your houses because we see that you're in a pre-modern state and you still have to go down to the well. Again, this is the social relations produced by particular technical arrangements are interesting. So famously, whether it's true or not, Robert Moses supposedly built the bridges on Long Island so low that public buses could not get to the beaches of Long Island. So it was, as it were, apartheid by concrete. In the case of the village in Spain, suddenly everybody has water delivered to their apartment or house. And the well, which had constituted the counter-hegemonic space in the village, goes away. The complexity of this, of course, is are you going to say, by the way, no reticulated water for you, because, keep your counter-hegemonic space and wash together, at the well. I had the same problem with a small group advising the ANC, who were then a government in waiting in South Africa. And we produced a document which suggested that it was not necessary, because it was, by the way, historically cyclists who demanded the paving of the planet. There was a very large, Chris is in the room, Chris Carlson and I talk about this. There was political cycling en masse back in the 19th century, 10,000 people in Market Street, 1896, demanding better roads. It's the dialectic of history. Now we go down there demanding that we tear them up. But no, the demand that we don't need to pave the planet, the full tarmac is not necessary. Let's have some intermediate infrastructure. Again, it's not maybe for Northerners to say to the modernizing elites of the South, oh, by the way, now, no roads for you. So this is, these are very complicated set of questions about the technical arrangements.
Yeah, I was just, other people have mentioned this since then, but, to kind of counter the triumphalist narratives of the counterculture, which is the triumph that sort of happened indirectly, there was a great deal of pushback, and I'm thinking about sort of that managerial revolution all over again. And I think of Marge Piercy, who wrote both in her great essay, The Grand Coulee Dam, which was a critique of gender politics. It's very easy to find on the left, and also on careerism, the growth of alternative careers in power, and then in small changes, which I hope it gets reprinted soon, because I think it's tremendously relevant to what's happening right now.
Well said.
Right, yeah.
So I had something to add. It's kind of a question as well. But in the talk about the Selectric typewriter, and then the discussion about women's labor, I think really needs to be kind of fleshed out here a little bit more beyond our reproductive labor, because of the rise of women perhaps in second wave feminism, which was 64 to 74 emerging movement, moving into the workplace or being more empowered psychologically, and their consciousness empowered in the workplace, and probably forming the largest pool of typists. So I'm just looking at the way that these magazines may have come together, back to that issue, and the social history of that is that there could very well have been a lot of women involved in that process who typed, because actually in digital culture, men have not learned to type frequently, and in older generations of digital users, because women were trained as secretaries. And of course, the feminist movement would have critiqued the role of the secretary. So in terms of having a countercultural impulse to move one's labor into another direction, then I'm just wondering what you think about that, or if that is something you've worked out.
So it does make sense. The Whole Earth World is the only one I know at that level of granular detail, and there are a whole lot of women in the Whole Earth World who are not known in the history of the Whole Earth. And they did a lot of typesetting, framing up, gluing, typing. I want to challenge your chronology a little bit, because I think one of the things that's in Jeff's book that I really, really like is there's a big shift from the American counterculture of 64, 65, 66 to the movement-based culture of the early 70s. When you see those Black Panther publications in the late 60s, when you see the women's rights, things like Off Our Backs, when you see queer rights stuff, that tends to be